Hello everybody, Brad the Guitarist here. In this video we're going to take a look at this 1982 Mesa Boogie Mark II. This was brought to me by a nice lady, lives down in Lexington, and she's also a watcher to the channel. She sent me a really cute and funny email about how she started out going to school as an electronics engineer and then got kind of sidetracked into doing software and things. And she just kind of let her skills go a little bit rusty, and this one needs a new power switch. The power cord ground is a little bit bent, so I'm going to try to bend that back into place. If I can't bend it right, then I'll replace that. Also, we're going to do just a general cleaning service, maintenance, cap job, all that sort of thing on this. And if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please stick around. If I'm not mistaken, they made a couple different versions of the Mark II. One of them had reverb, EQ also, which would have been over here in this area, and had kind of the graphics sort of sliders. This one doesn't have that and does not have reverb. It has a single input. Here's the foot switch. It looks like it has two inputs, but one of them is a foot switch. Here's the first volume, and it has a bright switch on it. The treble has a pull, which I think shifts the position of the treble pot. Basically, the mid position will be in a different place in the spectrum. Bass control, mids control, master volume number 1 with a gain boost push-pull, lead drive control with a pull on it as well, and a lead master volume with a pull on it for bright. On the rear, we can already see that this thing has two 6L6 power tubes, and these are 6L6Bs from Groove Tubes. These might still be okay. We'll check those out. We have 4 preamp tubes, and we'll take a little closer look at those in a bit. Also down here, which is interesting, this is something Mesa did back in the day. They have a little strap here and a spare preamp tube strapped to it, where you won't be caught out on your gig without an extra preamp tube, which is really thoughtful. We have some kind of little marking right here. It looks like MB initials or something like that. Could be an inspection mark, or it could just be Mesa Boogie. Somebody signed off on it in a flourish and said, here, send it on. We have an auxiliary plug with the ground, which is nice. Slow blow fuse. This one is supposed to be, let's see. This is not an export, which would have been a 1.5 amp. This should be a 60 watt 2.5 amp fuse. They actually will put a different fuse in this thing depending on which version it is. And let's make sure that the fuse is correct. This is a 2 1/2 amp fuse, so that's good. Always check those while we're looking at these, because you never know. This one has a ground switch also. That might be useful in some scenarios, but with the 3-prong cord, in today's world, any place you're going to play, if it's up to code, you're never going to need that. This has a slave knob, and this is interesting because this knob is exactly like the ones that you will see on old Valco amplifiers. That's like literally the same knob as a Valco from the 60s, which is just strange. Leave it to me to notice something like that. This is the control for the slave out. We have an effects loop, which is nice, with send and return. We have a presence control, which is not on the front, but on the back. We have a reverb that wasn't populated from the factory, and it's kind of sharpied out here. You can just barely see it, where it is written on probably some of these models. We have 3 different speaker outs, one for 8 ohm and 2 for 4 ohm. This thing also has a number, a chassis, or excuse me, a serial number, and these are sometimes instructive when dating things. 9059 on the serial. Again, those tubes are groove tubes. They look like they don't have a whole lot of hours on them, so I think they're probably going to end up being good. This thing has been serviced at some point by Video, excuse me, Electronics in Richmond, Kentucky. All right, the Mark series had several different versions, and this one is the Mark II-B. The Mark II within itself had a couple different versions. It had the Mark II-A, the Mark II-B, the Mark II-C, the Mark II-C Plus. This is the Mark II-B, and even within the Mark II-B, there were several different iterations of this thing. One of them had 4 power tubes for supposedly 100 watt output. Another one had 2 power tubes for 50 or 60 watt output, which is the one that we have. There was another one that supposedly was simulclass, which means it had 4 power tubes, but it was 75 watts, and 2 of the power tubes were run in triode mode. So when you switch to those, it was cut down to 15 watts. So several different iterations of this amp. The one that is shown here looks like it's a 100 watt version of the one that we have. So basically it's the same one with the 100 watt version and also with reverb, which this one does not have. If we zoom in here to the input section a little bit here, let's see. Fairly routine on the input. We've got a 1.5 bias resistor, 25 microfarad bypass capacitor. Although I don't recall really seeing this in the amp, so this may have been omitted in the one that we have. I may have to go back and look at the video, but I don't recall seeing this in the amp. And it probably doesn't need to be there, because to be honest, when you engage any of the bass, if you're trying to get like crunch tones, for instance, on the lead channel, it get really just nasty. And if you add any kind of bass at all, I mean, I had to tone the bass down to like 0 to get any real good tones out of this thing, and you'll see in the demo a little bit later what I mean. But the bass is almost on 0 or just off of 0 for most of the demo, so I don't know if this is even really necessary. We've got 266 volts here on the plate of the first stage, and they're doing that because they got the tone stack right after it, so they got to push through a lot of signal right after it. Bright switch right here with a small bright cap into the next stage. Pretty similar here on the bias for the next stage. And again, we have reverb in here after this stage where it ties in and loops, but in the one that we have, reverb is non-existent. This amp also has some relays in it for switching, which do not exist in the earlier Mark I. And there were some complaints about the Mark IIs, the early Mark IIs, the A and the B, with the relay switching being loud. When you would switch those, you would hear a pop. And if you recall the Mesa Boogie video that I did on the Roadster, they solved that in some different ways way on down the line. They started using JFETs and addressing that problem with some mute circuits that were kind of instantaneous or momentary. This one apparently is the first amp ever made that had a tube buffered effects loop, and this one had the effects loop is coming here off of a cathode and then into the next stage. And this effects loop is often cited as being kind of overdriving because of this sort of cathode follower setup. It overdrives certain pedals, so it's not an ideal effects loop for a lot of applications. Kind of a funky layout for a schematic, having the input over here on this side like that and then coming through and then back. But that's essentially what we do. We come through and then over to here, which is what is this? This is the EQ, and I think this is on versions with the EQ circuit. This one does not have the graphic EQ, so we basically skip that, I think, and then we go to the output section, which again is different in the one that we have. So that's essentially the Mark II-B. Well, first of all, let's get some pliers after this little ground on this cord. She didn't like that and kind of wanted the whole cord replaced, but I told her, you know, I can try to fix that and save you a few bucks if you want. I'll just kind of bend it back into shape. So we'll see what we can do with that. Okay, a couple seconds with some pliers, and that's at least straight, so it'll go in the socket straight. It's still got a little bit of a bend in it, but it does. I just checked it in the socket and it goes straight in. So I mean, you know, might as well keep this one. Another interesting feature here are these little brackets. You can see these right here, and I thought, well, is something missing? Was this thing supposed to have were these supposed to be sideways? Because there's one on this side, one on this side, and I was like, well, are these supposed to be sideways and hold on like a, you know, like a little back panel or something like that? But no, it occurred to me when I was trying to get the chassis, when I started getting the chassis out, these are so when you take the screws down, the chassis has something to drop onto, so you don't have to try to hold it up. Alright, here's the underside of the chassis, and the first thing you kind of notice is all of the Sharpie markings. I assure you those are factory. They're marking the tubes 12AX7, 12AT7, 12AX7. They also have a date marked there, 3/31/82. 12AX7 on this one. That's probably the phase inverter. You can see here EIA codes are 606 for Schematic, so they're still using Schematic transformers, but they're getting them custom made. This one is probably custom wound also to whatever specs Mesa wanted Schematic to wind it to. 1981, 39th week, and that will be your part number, probably a Mesa proprietary thing. This one's stamped Mesa as well, with an EIA code of 606-123, so 23rd week of 1981 on that one. And over here on this one, we also have a Schematic, and it's 606-82, 7th week of 1982. So this output transformer was made right before this thing shipped out. And we might as well get a better look at the preamp tubes. This one is looks like a Mesa labeled, oops, looks like a Mesa labeled Sovtech. Nope, it's just a regular old Sovtech. 12AX7WA. In some later Mesa amps, Sovtechs don't work so well, but this earlier one, it probably will be fine. That's a tongue sole, but this is a Russian tongue sole. No, excuse me, it's a tongues ram. Made in Hungary, pardon me. 12AX7. I've seen those here and there at times. This is an AX7 in the AT7 slot. So we may end up changing this depending on what we end up doing, but this is supposed to be a 12AT7, not a 12AX7. It's Mesa labeled, which leads me to believe it's probably an original tube for this thing, but it probably came from one of these other positions and someone moved it there. This is a good reason you should check all this stuff. This is a Chinese premium Audio Classic 12AX7. I don't know what's premium about it. These are, well, I mean, it's fairly a run of the. It's not gold pin or anything, so I don't know. Anyway, it's Chinese. So and also that tube is very close to the output. I'm not sure how I feel about that design. I mean, that's almost right up against it. There must not be any interference to speak of. But usually you would think that with the high voltage winding on the output, I don't know which side the high voltage winding is on here, but usually, you know, high voltage winding being this close to a preamp tube, hopefully that's not V1. That's the closest one to the input. If that's V1, that's kind of an iffy design as far as I'm concerned, but I don't know, maybe it works perfectly. One other thing I notice here that I'm going to change right now actually is these little retainers. Some people do that. They bend those down. What those are for is to keep the power tubes in place during transit. So I'm going to lift those up into position like they're supposed to be, like so. And we'll replace this tube, and what happens is those little grips on the sides of that thing will grip the tube and keep it from wiggling itself out. You might check your tube amps and see if they have these, and if they do, you need to be using them because that's what they're for. They make tube changes slightly harder because you sometimes, you know, you have to use two hands to press this down and then pull the tube out at the same time. But it's not that big of a deal. You definitely should use them if you have them. Okay, here's the business end of this thing, and we can see it's very similar in construction to the Mark 1 that I featured on my channel before, that combo. You have all of the power capacitors right here. Another 30 microfarad right there that we will change. We're also going to spray out the sockets, or excuse me, spray out the sockets, spray out the pots. I always mix that up. I don't know why. Clean the input jacks and the output jacks. And this thing looks very clean. Let's just admire it for a second. It is very clean. Got a couple inspection marks. No idea what they are. They look like hieroglyphics to me. That one looks like an L. And we have some stuff written up here on the side as well. And another one back there. So I'm thinking each worker was responsible, like this person put in this board, this person may have put in that board, this person wired up this, and then it looks like maybe you had some inspection people come behind them and check all their work. It's always interesting to see you know, how factories do their stuff. Whenever you can get kind of an insight like that, it's always interesting. Speaking of interesting, that's pretty cool. That's a very nice jack right there. Look at that. Look at the contacts on that jack. They weren't screwing around with this thing. Very nice jack. They could have just as easily put in something more like what they have on the input up here, like that, and it probably would have done the job, but they definitely weren't screwing around with that thing. Alright, well, let's get some caps together and we will recap this thing. One other thing I should mention here is that these chassis are multi-purpose. You see an extra preamp tube hole right over here. That would probably be for the reverb version. There's an extra hole right here for a jack as well. Probably two extra holes. There's another extra hole right there. So a couple extra holes for the send and return for the reverb, and another one for the reverb tube. And this board is labeled SP9B. The power board is probably the same in both versions, I would guess. And it is a power, what is that, PWR 7D. So that's the board part number for that board. And that's the board part number for this board. And there probably would have been a different part number for the one that included that tube and the reverb. One thing I don't see is the additional tube for the 100 watt version. Should be 2 additional tubes, but they don't. There's not. Well, I guess there is room for them, but they don't stamp them. So that's interesting. It's interesting that they would stamp this one and the extra holes there, but they wouldn't have this already stamped. There's also an extra stamp over here, a square one, right over there in that corner, which isn't being used on this particular model. I'm guessing they probably had a one with reverb as a 50 watt and one with reverb as a 100 watt. So they probably stamped two different chassis instead of 4 different chassis. Okay, these capacitors are drained, and on this board there are a couple standoffs over here that go through these holes, and you just clip them off the standoffs, and then there's one screw in between those 2 bigger capacitors, and it just screws into that thing, and this whole board will flip up, but still not very easily. This is definitely a bit more difficult than your typical fender cap change. It does come out of here relatively easily, with the exception of these 2 wires running to the standby switch, so I'm just going to remove the standby switch altogether and just bring it out with the, pop that through, and now then, that's better. Okay, this thing has 220 microfarad caps over here. These are the ones that are in series, I believe. 220 microfarad at 285 volts. I don't stock that value, unfortunately, but they do need to be changed. You see a little bubble right there? A little bubble right there on that one. And there's a little bubble on the anode on this one. So those, it's time for those to go for sure. These actually look a little bit bulged out on the end. If you look at them in profile, it's hard to tell, but they do look a little bit bulged out. But these are sealed, so you won't see little punctures like that so much, but you will see the whole thing kind of start to bulge out, and that's what it looks like those are doing. This one, that's marked Mesa Engineering, which is strange. They went through the trouble of having I guess that's Sprague. I think these are Sprague's also, to mark these as Mesa, that one and that one too. Strange. But anyway, we definitely are going to replace all these caps. We need a 30. We need these 3 are 30s, 2 of those at 500 volts, and we need these 220. So I'm going to have to order some caps.
I'm having a nervous breakdown. My heart is racing, my mind is pacing the floor around in circles, searching for the reasons why. And I find a million times when you had tried to make it better, but I was covered in bees. I don't wanna live without you, and you're not with me. I feel so empty, and as I spin around you, you seem so very stationary to me. But now I see just how your dreams always took a backseat to my instability.
Okay, there's all the caps installed on this board, and I have those wires hooked back up now. And now I'm on to this board, and the one large capacitor over here. And what I'm doing here, instead of pulling this board, which would require me to pull about, well, probably all of these pots up front, and if I didn't have to pull the pots, I would still risk breaking connections. Like, there are a lot of wires running to this board, and anything I can do to try to avoid pulling this board out to solder in this new component, I'm going to do. I'm actually doing this to save the board. It'll save the traces from being heated. It'll also save some of these connections from possibly breaking. So what I've done here is just clipped off the old leads and left those stuck in to the board, and then wound a couple of loops. See right there? Wound a couple of loops on my new component on both ends, and I'm going to solder these in just like this. Alright, now that cap is soldered in there, and it is just as secure as the original cap was. That's not going anywhere. It doesn't look quite as pretty, but it's actually a better thing to do than if I had pulled this whole board out of here, risked all these connections, taken all of the pots out, and actually desoldered it from the board. So, you know, it's not out of laziness that I'm doing this. This is a shortcut that also happens to be the right thing to do, I think, in this scenario. Okay, now on to the other thing, and I actually should have pulled this out of here before I put this board back, because it would have been a little bit easier. But I need to replace this power switch. All right, I've installed a new power switch, but this is one of the things that you run into quite often, actually, with switches. You can see right here, this one is a little bit longer than this one, and it also just has a different feel to it. It's a little clunkier than this one. This one's kind of dainty around here, so I think what I might do is instead of just changing this one, I'll change this one as well to match, because I do not have one this kind of short and dainty. These are little Mexican made switches, and all the ones that I have are larger USA made switches, big 3 to 6 amp switches. These are good switches, really a lot nicer of a switch than this thing, which is why this one broke. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and replace this switch as well with one of these switches so that these two more or less match. Alright, see, that's a bit more like it. The switches are about the same length and about the same sort of patina and the same sort of size, so a lot better match than the previous two. Alright, I got this thing hooked up to a test speaker out here on the bench. We're monitoring the power at the first power node, and we're going to dial it up on the Variac. Now what I usually like to do is just dial it up a little bit on the Variac and see what kind of readings we get at this first node before we go much further. Showing 73 volts. Haven't started reading anything on my input here yet, but so far so good. And anytime I have new caps like this, I like to just kind of dial it up first time on the Variac. Don't shock it to life. And just let the caps kind of form up naturally. This would also be the time if I made any mistakes in any wiring that it should show its ugly head. Got 171 volts now, and can't really see any glow yet on any tubes, but I shouldn't really yet. Okay, we're dialed up enough to have a reading here now at 66 volts on the input side, and we have 0.2 amps of current, so we're about where we expect to be. 258 volts and dropping, and this should come down as the tubes begin to conduct and warm up. So you should see this kind of drop, settle down. And I should start to either hear something at this point pretty soon. Yeah, there we go. Okay, I do have some noise at the output. And I do still need to clean these pots. Getting a little bit more crackling and stuff than I would expect, though. That's interesting right there. That is the pot for the slave out, I think. No, excuse me, that's the presence control. Okay, so that presence control is real dirty. Alright, let's kill it. Actually, we'll just leave that on and just kill it here. Dial it back down. And the reason I want to kill it before spraying anything is because this stuff is the stuff that I use can be flammable. This is the stuff that I normally use for pretty much everything, and that's also including pots. Now, the reason I feel fine using pots with this stuff is because I've been doing it for a while and I've never had any problems with it, like degreasing the pot shafts or anything like that. As long as you don't flood it too much, just a couple tiny little sprays, you're basically getting the you're spraying the contacts off the carbon strip rather than getting it up in the shaft where it can actually eat away at the grease. If you're interested in picking some of this stuff up, this is about the cheapest stuff there is. If you go to somewhere like Radio Shack, even if you go and get this stuff through like Antique Electronics Supply and stuff, contact cleaner, generally speaking, is just expensive shit. But I usually get this stuff fairly cheaply. You can get it at, instead of going to a music kind of specialty place, you can get this stuff through auto stores or just on Amazon, and usually be better off than if you went through one of the music or electronics specialty stores. Usually the electronics or music oriented places, any kind of contact cleaner is going to usually cost you an arm and a leg. This CRC stuff is pretty good though. I've had a lot of good luck with it. It does a pretty good job. But most contact cleaners that you use, the stuff is going to be flammable, and you don't really want to use it while the amp is energized. Oh, that's a good rule of thumb. I'm not going to say otherwise. I do personally sometimes break my own rule on that front if I'm just being a little bit lazy, but it's probably not a great idea. Now, these didn't seem very dirty, but I'm going to clean them anyway. This pot was somewhat dirty, so it won't hurt to clean it at all. And we may as well also go ahead and clean the input jack since we're in the process of cleaning anyway. What I usually do is take a little brush like this, and I will give you a link to where you can get some brushes like this too, down in the description, and also probably in the comment, the top comment. But you need a brush like this to really clean input jacks. What I usually do is stick it a part of the way in and then use my contact cleaner and spray some pretty liberally in there, and then just run it in and out. What that's going to do, that's going to clean the tip as well as the sleeve there. So I think we're ready to fire it up again. Let's fire it up again. Oh yeah, it did a lot of good on that presence control. Now some of the rumbling and stuff may also be dirty sockets. I have not yet cleaned the sockets. Yeah, see that right there? See that? Man, that's a socket. Okay, check this out. This tube right here, which I think once again is should be the input tube. This one, that's the one that's closest to this output transformer. Okay, so we have an output transformer really close to the input tube, which I don't think is a really great design. That's it right there, and that has got to be it, because we have cord running from the input to that tube, so that's got to be that's the first stage, that tube. And look at this. All right, it's for one, the socket's very dirty, so we need to clean that socket. But with this on there, this shield, it seemed to be even worse. Look at that. That's strange for the power indicator light to be doing something because of wiggling a tube. That's strange. Let's see if it. The voltage is changing a bit too. On that reading at least, and that's on that first node. I don't know how I feel about all that. And another thing, I don't think these output tubes, now that I'm looking at them, I don't think they're matched. They're different sizes. One of them is longer in the bottle than the other one, which is weird. They look the same. And they're both groove tubes. Whoop. Yeah, cat-like reflexes. Yeah, these sockets need to be cleaned for sure. I'm getting pretty much none of the crackle and mess at the output that I was before, and that's because that's just from wiggling these tubes. But we're gonna do it properly, and we'll spray that. We'll go ahead and spray those out. All right, I've gone ahead and dialed it up the rest of the way, and we have 463 volts at that first power node, and at 120 volts on the input, we're only drawing about 0.68 or 0.69 amps. So that's pretty good. It's about where we want to be. Not anything unusual going on with anything that I can tell. You can pull the lead channel on. These controls also work. Another interesting thing about these amps, This, along with the Carbon X series, I think were some of the earliest channel switching amps you could really get that were production amplifiers. This one is foot switchable, so it has a normal volume and it has a lead drive channel, and you can either pull it here to engage the lead drive channel, or you can use the foot switch. I think as far as the servicing goes, we may be nearing the end here, but we just need to spray those sockets out and then give this thing a test. Okay, let's clean all these tube sockets. I'll start with this one first, and basically I just want to flood the thing with spray, and then you can usually clean it just by inserting and reinserting your tube a couple times, and usually that will clean off those contacts to pretty decent satisfaction. Now sometimes if it doesn't clean it, someone on one of the forums the other day suggested you get those little brushes that you use to clean between your teeth. It's kind of like they're kind of like small single-use little brushes, and that you can use in lieu of flossing. I forget what they're called, but I haven't tried those yet, but that's actually a really good suggestion, and I'm probably going to get some of those and try those out. This might be a good time to address something that I kind of get asked about a lot, and that's whether or not you can touch tubes with your bare hands. The answer to that is yes. There's a prevailing myth out there for some reason that says don't touch tubes with your bare hands because the oil on your hands will get on the tubes and then destroy the tubes. That just isn't true. It's a wives' tale. I'm not even really sure 100% where it came from. There are probably some vacuum tubes in the early days of vacuum tube technology that that does apply to. But any modern tubes, anything made after the 1930s that I'm aware of, you can touch with your hands, and it's not going to affect anything. You're not any residue that you leave is not going to kill the tube. It's not going to fry it in any way or cause burns or any of that stuff. So I'm not even really sure where that comes from. There are some halogen lights, I believe. So the really high wattage halogen lights that you can't touch. Because when they're so hot, extremely hot, that if you get some of your finger grease on there, that can destroy those. But as far as vacuum tubes, no, that's a wives' tale. I did want to show you how to extract vacuum tubes from these clips, though, if you don't have any experience doing this. What you want to do, it takes two hands. What you want to do is just gently spread out this retainer. On the bottom here, you have to kind of push it apart a little bit, and then grab at the base of the tube. Don't grab up here, because this part and the base are actually adhered together. So if you grab up here and start to wiggle around, you may break it loose from the base, and you'll see tubes all the time that are broken loose from the base. They might still work for a little while, but it's not a good thing to do to your tubes. So you spread apart this retainer at the bottom, and you want to reach all the way down and grab the plastic part, the base, and kind of wiggle it around in a circular motion until it comes out. I'll show you again on this one. You spread them like this, and then grab like this on the plastic, and then wiggle around in a circular motion, okay, like that, until it comes out. And the reason to do it in a circular motion, instead of wiggling it just back and forth, is because it kind of walks its way out of each of the pins instead of walking out that side and then that side, and you still have a couple of pins holding on. So it's really better to go in a circular kind of motion. But yeah, let's go ahead and spray these sockets as well. Okay, so let's get this thing back in the cabinet and give it a test now. This will give us a good chance to talk about the best way to microphone up one of these Mesa Boogie amplifiers. The best way to do it, a lot of people you'll see will microphone these with the microphone facing the front of the head like this. And while that can work really well, What I usually like to do is to come in over the top of the amplifier in this fashion, and I find that gives me a little bit more of a mid-rangey kind of a honky funky distant kind of a tone, a little bit more distant than if you mic'd it up here. It sounds almost like you're in a hallway, and I enjoy this tone much better. Alright, it's time to give this thing a test, and I'm sorry if you don't like heavy metal, but a Mesa Boogie pretty much means that it's time for a heavy metal wanking, so here we go.